We're here today to talk about the opportunities and challenges related to the production of critical minerals, whether through traditional mining, processing and refining, or innovative secondary recovery and reprocessing techniques. Welcome to our witnesses, and thank you for being here for this discussion. I think it's going to be very, very informative. Next week, we will continue this conversation about critical mineral supply chains and discuss the demand side and how industry will obtain and recycle these vital materials. These conversations are so important right now as the horrifying events in Ukraine show how problematic our reliance on foreign suppliers who may not share our interests and values can be. In the immediate term, our concern is, of course, Russia. But I'm also extremely concerned with China as the gatekeeper of the critical minerals that we need for everyday life that we've really taken for granted, in addition to the minerals crucial to energy and defense applications. It makes no sense to remain beholden to bad actors when we have abundant resources and manufacturing know-how here in the United States. And to make no mistake, we are beholden particularly when it comes to many of the minerals that go into clean energy technologies. That is why I've sounded the alarm about going down the path of EVs alone and advocated for equal treatment for hydrogen. China mines 60% of global rare earth elements, crucial to high-tech applications and magnets needed for electric motors. Even more shocking, China processes almost 90% of the rare earths regardless of where they're mined in the world. The only large-scale producers of cobalt are in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where Chinese interests control many of the mines. And then 65% of the processing is done in China. Lithium is mined extensively by Australia, an ally that produces over 50% of global supply. However, China processes over 58% of global lithium and uses that material to feed their lithium battery manufacturing. It's clear that we have a problem, and the United States Geological Survey concurs. The USGS has identified 50 minerals as critical, meaning that the supply is crucial to our national and economic security and at risk of a supply disruption. I believe so strongly that we need to address vulnerabilities rather than increase them. Now is not to say that we have failed to take any action to address these risks. This committee got the Energy Act of 2020 across the finish line at the end of the 116th Congress, which contained several important provisions related to critical minerals. Then Chairwoman Murkowski and myself led the effort to include the American Mineral Security Act, which created the critical mineral listing process and provided the first comprehensive update to critical minerals and materials policies since 1980. The Energy Act also included my bill to accelerate the research and development needed to recover rare earth elements and other critical minerals from coal and coal byproducts. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act built on those efforts and serious investments to the tune of $3 billion to build domestic battery material processing facilities and fund battery processing demonstration projects. We also expanded the Department of Energy's Innovative Energy Loan Guarantee Program so that the critical mineral projects are now eligible. Lesser known but equally vital, provisions made improvements to the permitting process, accelerated the Geological Survey's mapping efforts to support mineral development, and funded a program to create a commercial demonstration of rare earth processing facility fed by mineral waste. While we have made such good progress, there is so much more to be done. Right now, we're not mining, processing, manufacturing, or recycling these materials domestically. And these issues aren't solved overnight. Many actions we need to take have long planning, permitting, and construction timelines. So the work needs to start now. And the administration needs to help make responsible mining and refining possible here, rather than making it more difficult and challenging. New mines will be needed both here in the United States and all over the world, but we must not become so desperate for these minerals that we throw our bedrock environmental and labor laws out the window, or rely on countries that don't adhere to the same standards. Mining companies today find it harder and harder to obtain and maintain their social licenses to operate. As I've said before, I believe that reasonable updates to the mining law of 1872 would go a long way towards addressing those concerns. It only takes one or two accidents to put a stain on the entire industry. And when you lose buy-in from the local communities, the entire nation can be affected. So it's extremely important. I also believe that there's another area that we should lean on, North American Energy Alliance, and work with our Canadian neighbors to source what doesn't make sense to do domestically. And there is no reason the United States cannot utilize our manufacturing base and leverage our relationships with friendly nations like Australia and Canada to ensure that their critical minerals are sent here for processing instead of China. However, in order to accomplish this, we first need to establish our own domestic separation, processing and refining capabilities, and make sure that we're not exporting our own critical minerals for processing somewhere else. So while we've made some strides in the laws I've mentioned, that was just the first step. I want to know where other challenges exist and the opportunities to tackle them. Finally, we should be getting creative and exploring innovative solutions to the problem, using new approaches to extract critical minerals like rare earths from old mine tailings, waste materials, and even acid mine drainage can be an opportunity to address an environmental problem and a critical mineral challenges at the same time. To that end, I'm very pleased to have Dr. Zemkowicz. Am I close? Dr. Z?
No, he's shaking his head no.
I am so happy to have Dr. Z with us today. He's going to share the good work he's doing as the director of the West Virginia Water Resources Institute at West Virginia University. That's not too far from here. I'm going to tell you, if you get a chance to go, and I know a lot of you are interested, you ought to see what they're doing. You ought to see what they're extracting and how he's doing it. And they're going to commercial now, right? Yep. As many of you know, our coal communities bear the scars that have mined the coal to power the country to be greatness that we are. This legacy includes acid mine drainage that pollutes streams across West Virginia as a result of abandoned and bond-forfeited mines. But while this harmful pollution is a blight on our communities, Paul and his team have done incredible work in partnership with the National Energy Technology Lab and West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection. They are demonstrating that we can clean up these problems areas while extracting the rare earth elements that we need in the process. This work has the potential to be a game changer, not just for my state, but for the entire country. And I'm told that it could even assist many of our western states with acid mine drainage from hard rock mines. Dr. Z and I'm thrilled to have you with us today and look forward to hearing about the progress that you all have been making. In closing, the critical mineral issue is a vital and urgent important to our national economic security, and I truly believe that this is a bipartisan issue that we can work together to address, and we've taken some steps in that direction. Senators Murkowski, Risch, Cassidy, and I recently sent a letter asking the President to utilize the Defense Production Act to accelerate our production of critical minerals for lithium-ion batteries. It sounds like there might be an announcement being made today to take steps in that direction, and I welcome that news and look forward to seeing the details. Additionally, Senator Brasso and I have introduced the Mining Schools Act of 2022 to ensure that we have the next generation of STEM graduates to tackle these problems. Demand is increasing for minerals vital to clean energy and national security technologies, as well as for everyday tools and comforts that we take for granted. We must take action domestically, or we'll be putting our own security at risk by allowing China this power over our supply chains. Now, I appreciate all of you today for being here, the witnesses, and we're going to learn an awful lot, and I'm going to turn to Senator Brasso for his opening remarks now.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate your partnership and your dedication to the work that's being done today and for holding this very important, critical hearing on an issue so important to our nation and our nation's future. Upon taking office, President Biden returned the United States to the Paris Climate Agreement, one that I see as deeply flawed and unfair. The President pledged to reduce our nation's greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 52% below the levels from where they were in 2005 and get all of this done in the next 8 years by the year 2030. To achieve these objectives, the President says he wants to make our nation's power sector carbon-free by 2035. He also aims to ensure that so-called zero-emission vehicles make up 50%, half of all new vehicle sales, just 8 years from now. In short, President Biden wants to dramatically increase the number of wind turbines, solar panels, and electric vehicles in the country. And this means a massive increase in the demand for critical minerals. Last year, the International Energy Agency published a report on critical minerals. It included 2 noteworthy charts. The first chart shows how electric vehicles require far more minerals than vehicles with internal combustion engines. So a conventional car needs this much, electric car, take a look at that. And this is the list of all of the different critical minerals that are there and how many kilograms are needed per vehicle on each of the critical minerals. Ones that we don't have access to, don't have here, and here we have the conventional vehicle versus an electric car. The second chart that I want to show from the International Energy Agency report on critical minerals shows how wind turbines and solar panels require far more minerals than nuclear, than natural gas, and the coal-fired power plants. So here you have the critical minerals needed for natural gas, coal, nuclear, solar, onshore wind, and offshore wind. And look at that jump for the offshore wind and onshore wind concerned and compared to natural gas and coal. It is a remarkable difference in the need for critical minerals to go and move our economy from where we are in energy to where the Biden administration promises to be in 8 years. So new demand for minerals can't only come from the United States, come from the entire world. The World Bank recently looked at the demand for copper. Copper is a big part of those signs. It found that to meet the world's demand for copper in the next 25 years, the world will have to mine the same amount of copper that the world has mined in the last 5,000 years. Mr. Chairman, these figures are astonishing. Despite his climate pledges, President Biden has done nothing meaningful to boost American mineral production. In fact, this administration, the Biden administration, has only made it more difficult to access minerals here at home in America. In March of last year, the U.S. Forest Service rescinded an environmental impact statement for a land swap necessary for a major copper mine in Arizona. In August of last year, the Bureau of Land Management proposed withdrawing 10 million acres in Wyoming from mineral exploration. The list goes on. In January of this year, the Interior Secretary Holland canceled leases for a new nickel and copper mine in Minnesota. And last month, the Department of Interior said it would withdraw a right-of-way for a road necessary for a new copper mine in Alaska. The Department of Interior also proposed designated critical habitat for a flower that complicates the permitting of a new lithium mine in Nevada. Mr. Chairman, President Biden's war on American energy isn't confined to oil and natural gas and coal. His policies, the policies of this administration, are killing the development of resources needed for the alternatives that the President says he wants. Now, currently it takes an average of 10 years to permit a new mine in the United States. And he wants all of this in place in 8 years. It just doesn't add up. We have one of the lengthiest permitting processes in the world. Now, Canada and Australia, which do have robust environmental and safety standards, permit new mines within 2 or 3 years. No reason we should not be able to replicate their success here in America. The administration is talking about using the Defense Production Act for minerals. Unless the President streamlines permitting, we should not expect to see any meaningful increase in American mineral production. Currently, the United States is 100% dependent, 100% dependent on imports of 17 key minerals. We're over 50% dependent on imports of another 30 minerals. President Biden doesn't reverse course and stand up to the mining opponents in his own party. It's only going to get worse, and it'll mean that we will continue to fund our adversaries as we are doing today with Russia. We have seen this all too very clearly since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. While President Biden finally banned imports of Russian oil, natural gas, and coal, we continue to import Russian uranium. President Biden can and should ban imports of Russian uranium. He should also help boost American uranium production. As with other critical minerals, we have the resources here in the United States. We just need the political will to use them. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. I'd like to turn to a panel of witnesses that we have with us and thank each and every one of you. Dr. Steve Fortier, Director of the USGS National Minerals Information Center with the U.S. Department of Interior. Ms. Abigail Wolf, Vice President of Critical Mineral Strategy and Director of the Center for Critical Mineral Strategy with Securing America's Future Energy. We have Mr. Scott Melby, is that correct? Mm-hmm. Okay. President of Uranium Producers of America, Ms. Julia Padilla, and she is Chief Regulatory Officer at Twin Metals, Minnesota, and Dr. Paul Zimkovich. Ha-ha. Nailed that one, didn't I, Paul? Director of the West Virginia Water Research Institute, West Virginia University. We'll start with Dr. Fortier.
Good morning, Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the U.S. Geological Survey efforts related to critical minerals. The USGS quantifies the geologic potential for undeveloped mineral deposits and in mined wastes across the nation and globe, and provides data on global supply, demand, and consumption of mineral commodities essential to the nation's economic and national security interests. USGS Mineral Resource Science looks across applications and economic sectors, analyzes near-term supply chain disruption potential, and evaluates long-term strategies for securing supply chains. Monitoring supply chains for individual minerals across manufacturing sectors allows us to understand supply risk in the short term and anticipate potential disruptions in the future. USGS data show that domestic and global demand for mineral commodities continues to increase. An increasingly broad range of mineral commodities is used in consumer and national security applications, especially those involving advanced technologies. While the United States remains a major mineral producer with an estimated total value of non-fuel mineral production of $90.4 billion in 2021, reliance on imports for essential mineral raw materials, as documented by the USGS, has increased markedly over the past several decades. In 2021, the nation was 100% import reliant for 17 mineral commodities and at least 50% import reliant for an additional 30 mineral commodities. 31 minerals listed by the USGS in 2021 as having greater than 50% net import reliance are on the current critical minerals list. China is a major import source for 18 of those critical minerals. The Energy Act of 2020 defined critical minerals as those which are essential to the economic or national security of the United States, have a supply chain that is vulnerable to disruption, and serve an essential function in the manufacturing of a product, the absence of which would have significant consequences for the economic or national security interests of the United States. Based on the Energy Act of 2020 definition, minerals or materials such as fuel minerals, water, and common varieties of industrial minerals such as sand and gravel are excluded from the definition of a critical mineral. In 2021, the USGS published a report entitled Methodology and Technical Input for the Review and Revision of the U.S. Critical Minerals List to comply with the requirement of the Energy Act of 2020. After posting a draft revision to the critical mineral list in the Federal Register and consideration of public comments on the methodology in the draft list, the final revised list was published on February 24, 2022. The 2022 list of critical minerals contains 50 individual mineral commodities. It differs from the 2018 list of critical minerals by individually listing the rare earth elements and platinum group elements by specific element forms rather than as two groups. Nickel and zinc were added to the list, and helium, potash, rhenium, strontium, and uranium were removed from the list, the latter to comply with the language in the Energy Act of 2020. There are multiple mechanisms to reduce the supply risk for mineral commodities, including 1, reducing demand through manufacturing improvements or substitution with other materials, 2, increasing supplies obtained from reliable trading partners, and 3, increasing domestic secondary production, such as recycling and reprocessing mine wastes, or domestic primary production, that is mining. Both domestic primary production and secondary production will be supported by an updated and more detailed understanding of potential resources as envisioned by the USGS Earth Mapping Resources Initiative, EarthMRI. The bipartisan infrastructure law funding to support EarthMRI is an historic investment in modernizing the nation's mapping of resources, both those still in the ground and those in mined wastes. EarthMRI is a partnership of the USGS, the state geological surveys, and other federal, state, tribal, and private sector organizations to modernize the nation's surface and subsurface mapping. The bipartisan infrastructure law provided $320 million over 5 years to the USGS to support EarthMRI's national mapping and interpretation of mineral resources data, as well as $24 million for the preservation of geophysical, geochemical, and geological data and samples. Data collected through EarthMRI will support development of a national mine waste inventory, assessments quantifying the nation's domestic mineral resources, as called for in the Energy Act of 2020, and identification of locations suitable for sustainable development, as called for in the June 6, 2021 report developed in pursuant to Executive Order 14017, America's Supply Chains. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak with the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee about the USGS work on critical minerals and for your continued interest in this important topic.
Thank you, Dr. Fortier. Ms. Wolf.
Thank you for having me here this morning. Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Given the distinguished mining experts on the panel, I plan to focus my opening remarks a little further downstream in the mineral supply chain. We wouldn't be here talking about critical minerals. In fact, they wouldn't be considered critical at all if it weren't for the stuff that they go into. And this stuff happens to be critically important for the US economy and national security. This stuff includes batteries, semiconductors and electric vehicles, renewable energy, and advanced weapons systems, all of which are made of and powered by minerals and mined materials. We are only going to need more of these things as the world increasingly transitions to an electric, connected, and autonomous future. And make no mistake, the future is electric. Not because of government financial support or environmental consciousness, which are certainly major factors today, but because our lives are becoming more digital and autonomous, which inherently means more electric. Also, EVs are becoming more economically viable on their own terms, paving the way for mass adoption for average consumers. In fact, major US automakers have already pledged to boost their share of EVs anywhere from 50 to 100% of new auto production over the next 20 years. All of those millions of new EVs will run on batteries, and all of those batteries will require processed minerals in seismically vaster quantities than are being produced today. Our industries compete in a global marketplace, and our key sectors, led by our auto sector, will rely on these critical materials to effectively compete and lead the electrified world. But as things stand, without some significant course corrections on America's critical minerals enterprise, the leading automobile power won't be the United States. It will be China. Not because of superior design or technology, but because of their massive head start and established market power, if not utter dominance, in all aspects of the supply chain that powers these vehicles. But simply mining alone does not begin to address the fundamentals of America's mineral supply chain challenge. Where we are most lacking, and where China is most dominant, is in that crucial but largely hidden processing phase and midstream component production. One simply can't dig up a rock and stick it in a Tesla. You have to crush it, smelt it, and refine it into precursor material that is then sold to somebody else to turn it into battery guts, namely cathodes, anodes, and electrolytes. Today, the United States has less than 4% of all minerals processing capacity and makes 0% of the world's cathodes and anodes. By contrast, China is the world's largest processor of copper, nickel, cobalt, lithium, and rare earth elements, and they control 60% of anode production and 40% of global cathode production. Consider that in 2019, about 70% of the world's cobalt supply was mined in the DRC, but more than 70% of that cobalt was refined in or controlled by China. The first metric is an act of nature. The second is an act of policy. We cannot risk the US auto sector being hollowed out. It contributes more than $1 trillion to our economy, and indirectly makes up more than 5% of our GDP. Made in America cannot just mean assembling, essentially snapping together, vehicle parts whose most important components come from somewhere else, especially when that's an unreliable foreign source. Laying claim to the automobile supply chain of the future will take bigger, bolder investments in mineral processing and battery component production. The $6 billion in the bipartisan infrastructure law is a good start, but there's much more that should be done, as outlined in my submitted testimony. This includes the all-important human capital factor, as America simply doesn't have enough metallurgists and other mineral experts for the scale of the effort this challenge requires. And finally, it will take a commitment to supply chain transparency, including potentially a new EV labeling requirement that shows where different components and materials come from and at what human and environmental cost. This will require working with like-minded allies and partners in both interests and values, including and especially our North American allies, to level the playing field and create a new race to the top with high environmental and labor standards for the raw materials that will power our tech-driven economies. Thank you for your time today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so very much for the testimony, Ms. Wolf. Mr. Melby.
Thank you, Chairman Manchin and Ranking Member Barrasso and committee members. I'm the Executive Vice President of Uranium Energy Corp. With operations in the states of Wyoming and Texas, and I'm also the President of the Uranium Producers of America. As a second-generation American uranium miner, With 37 years of experience in the nuclear fuel industry, I'm proud to lead the trade association representing the domestic uranium mining and conversion industry. It's an honor to testify regarding America's dangerous reliance on strategic competitors for critical minerals like uranium. Nuclear power is an indispensable part of the American economy, powering 1 in 5 U.S. homes and supplying over 50% of our carbon-free power. As we integrate more and more intermittent sources of energy like wind and solar onto the grid, nuclear power represents a crucial carbon-free baseload capacity that ensures that the lights always stay on. Unfortunately, almost none of the fuel needed to power America's nuclear fleet today comes from domestic producers. Employing predatory market practices, state-owned entities in Russia, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan now supply nearly half of the uranium consumed by U.S. nuclear utilities. We estimate that more than $1 billion per year in nuclear fuel purchases are flowing from the United States to Rosatom, the Russian state atomic energy company, which is an extension of the Kremlin and clearly part of the Russian military complex. It's simply unconscionable to allow U.S. dollar uranium purchases to continue funding the Putin war machine. Members of the committee, I would like to offer a roadmap for ending U.S. reliance on Russia for nuclear fuel. First, ban imports of Russian uranium. The UPA strongly supports bipartisan legislation introduced by Ranking Member Barrasso and Representatives Pete Stauber and Vicente Gonzalez in the House to impose a ban on Russian uranium imports. The U.S. has ample uranium resources and the capacity to produce them at the highest environmental, safety, and health standards in the world. Together with free world uranium suppliers in Canada, Australia, and Western Europe, UPA's member companies stand ready to work with the U.S. utilities, Congress, and the administration to ensure that every existing and planned domestic reactor will be able to maintain operations. Second, establish the Strategic Uranium Reserve. The reserve is the result of multiple federal investigations and studies which determine that America's reliance on uranium imports threatens national security. Congress funded the reserve at $75 million for the fiscal year 2021, yet 15 months later, the DOE has not yet stood up the program. DOE must stop delaying and move forward on this program immediately. In the meantime, Congress must continue its support of the reserve and provide the full funding initially requested by DOE, $150 million per year. Third, create a domestic source of high-assay, low-enriched uranium, or HALEU. This fuel is critical for the advanced reactor projects that have been such a high priority for this committee. The only current commercial source of HALEU is Russia. Without swift action to develop alternatives, the next generation of nuclear power will be entirely dependent on Russia for fuel. A crucial immediate step is the downblending of existing inventories through which DOE could create a stopgap source of HALEU while domestic capabilities for long-term supply can be established. And fourth, uranium must be maintained on the federal critical minerals list. Uranium's non-fuel uses are critical to national security. According to the USGS, these include radiation shields, counterweights, armor-piercing, kinetic energy penetrators, as well as life-saving medical isotope production. Our rare earth and critical mineral dependence on China is strikingly similar to what could happen with uranium if we don't act with urgency. My important message to you today is that the domestic uranium industry can meet this challenge. Given a level global playing field, the domestic uranium industry has the capacity to produce significant quantities of competitive and geopolitically secure uranium. While almost all of our capacity is idle today, the domestic industry can produce over 20 million pounds of annual production, enough to fuel close to half our U.S. reactors. A robust domestic supply chain for nuclear fuel has never been more necessary. We stand ready to meet America's energy and national security needs, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thanks so much, Mr. Melby. Ms. Padilla.
Good morning. Chairman Manchin, Ranking Member Barrasso, and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify. My name is Julie Padilla, and I serve as the Chief Regulatory Officer for Twin Metals, Minnesota. I'm here today to testify that if this country wants to produce its own nickel, it has to mine in Minnesota. If we want our own cobalt, platinum, and palladium, we have to get it in Minnesota. Northeastern Minnesota, where Twin Metals has proposed to operate, sits on top of the largest undeveloped deposit of these minerals in the world. The area contains a stunning 95% of the U.S. nickel resources, 88% of our cobalt, 75% of our platinum group metals, and a third of the country's copper. A domestic source for critical minerals means Minnesota. I know this committee has a deep understanding of why these minerals are fundamental for fighting climate change with technologies like electric vehicles, for our national security, for bringing supply chains home, and for creating American jobs. That's why we at Twin Metals are passionate about advancing a modern, environmentally safe, underground critical minerals project. And while the President himself has said we should do more of this here at home, the Departments of Agriculture and the Interior have instead taken actions to prohibit critical mineral mining in Minnesota. In October of last year, the Department of Agriculture requested to ban mining on 250,000 acres of federal land in Minnesota, taking virtually all of our country's nickel, cobalt, platinum, and palladium off the table. This proposed ban fails to recognize the 130-year history of mining in the same watershed, including operating non-ferrous mines just over the border in Canada. And this decision was made without reviewing the mine plan our company put forward. And let me be clear on that. We've never asked for anything but a fair process, a thorough review of our mine plan. To proceed with a mining ban means the government isn't going to consider the best information in front of it to determine whether mining can be done safely in this region. In addition, our mineral leases have been the subject of a political back and forth, most recently canceled again in January, which further delays our project and discussions we've had with domestic manufacturers who are interested in the direct purchase of our nickel and cobalt. The United States simply is no longer considered to have a stable regulatory climate. The precedent set by these actions shows that a company can invest hundreds of millions of dollars in this country, create good-paying, reliable jobs, earn the support of its local communities, and spend a decade developing a project for it to be arbitrarily canceled. And it's not just mining at risk here. Political battles are being created for projects ranging from recycling facilities to natural gas pipelines to solar arrays and wind farms. Project opponents are sowing distrust in the very regulatory system that these projects depend on for fairness and certainty. And these decisions have real-world impacts. Instead of expanding our team as planned, this month we had to lay off a third of our workforce and end millions of dollars in local contractor work while we seek to have these decisions reversed. As the project is stalled, so are jobs for local labor unions and the region's economic development. Our ability as a country to fight climate change and produce electric vehicles is in the hands of foreign powers, including Russia and China. Unless the United States fosters a reliable, fair, and timely process for environmental review of domestic mining projects, as it has in the past, we will be required to get these resources from foreign sources. We already have a system for determining whether projects like ours can operate safely and protect the environment. NEPA is exhaustive, it's science-based, and it's prescribed in law, and Twin Metals should be undergoing that process right now. Instead, I am unfortunately here today because we, like so many others, are fighting arbitrary actions aimed at circumventing that process in order to pick winners and losers based on politics rather than reviewing the science and facts. The United States has an opportunity to access its domestic mineral resources in an environmentally safe way and under the highest of labor and environmental standards. We can mine here better than anywhere else in the world, but the United States will not be able to do that under the current regulatory process that is unpredictable, subject to political manipulation, with changing rules in each administration, and in conflict with the priorities of our nation. It's past time for Congress to take action. I ask that you rescind the proposed mineral withdrawal and bring stability, fairness, and predictability back to the regulatory process for mining in this country. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. And finally, we're going to have Dr. Z for his opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Chairman Manchin and Ranking Member Barrasso and members of the committee for the opportunity to discuss today the work that we've been doing to recover critical minerals and rare earth elements from acid mine drainage. I'm the director of the Water Research Institute at West Virginia University. I've been there for 34 years, and most of what I've been doing is making acid mine drainage a predictable, recoverable, treatable, and preventable pollutant. It's the biggest single pollutant in the northern Appalachian and central Appalachian streams. Thousands of miles are impacted by acid mine drainage. Most of our work has been taking place in the prediction and developing industry scale processes for making it not be a problem, even though it potentially could be. At the same time, when the opportunity came up from the Department of Energy to look at coal waste products for recovery of rare earth elements, we thought this would be a good idea for acid mine drainage, because acid mine drainage is essentially free acid. And acid is what's needed to leach rare earth elements out of host rock. So if you have a conventional hard rock mine for rare earth elements, you have to get a mining permit, you have to dig it up, grind up the rock, subject it to strong acids and bases in order to put the rare earth elements in solution. We already start there. And furthermore, you cannot treat acid mine drainage to Clean Water Act standards without recovering all of the metals, including the rare earth elements. So we've developed a process. It is now in the development stage right now, to the extent that we're building a 1,000-gallon a minute plant with the West Virginia DEP near Mount Storm, West Virginia. That plant is part of the Office of Special Reclamation at DEP, and that takes over bond forfeiture sites and treats those discharges. We see this as, and so does DEP, see this as an opportunity to recover value in the treatment of acid mine drainage rather than simply spending money for an environmentally useful purpose, but there's actually a return on that investment. So we can actually cost out, for example, how much lime it would take to neutralize all the acid coming into this plant and calculate the value of the rare earths that would be recovered, and it's about 3 times more. So this would more than cover the main operations and management cost of these big treatment plants. We see a lot of opportunities, not only in the coal world, but also hard rock world. We have a relationship with the Montana Resources at Butte, Montana. We've characterized the acid mine drainage coming into the Horseshoe Bend plant there. It's an excellent resource. And the interesting thing is, the makeup of the rare earth elements coming into these hard rock mines and coal mines are almost identical. And when I say identical, they're not only the same distribution of elements, but it's heavily skewed toward the heavy rare earth elements. If you open a conventional hard rock mine like the one we have in Mountain Pass, California, it's a bastnasite deposit, and it's almost all light rare earths. We are 45% to 50% heavy rare earths. The Chinese, for example, are desperate to get their hands on heavy rare earth elements. We can start with that, and that's the basis of the feasibility study that we just finished up for the DOE that would build a central concentrator in West Virginia for rare earth element recovery from hard rock and acid mine drainage-based resources. And we think, and we found that the economics are very favorable. This would start out mainly because of the heavy distribution, heavy rare earth distribution, and also the cobalt, nickel, and manganese that we have in acid mine drainage. All of these contribute to a self-sustaining, organically self-sustainable facility that could then start bringing in feedstock from other sources, not just hard rock mines, but also other sources and waste sources, phosphate mines, bauxite tailings. We're looking at all these right now as potential feedstocks to come into this central plant. And I'll finish by saying that we looked at almost all of the international applications under, it's a fiduciary process that is required to attract investment money for a new mine. NC 43, you probably know the number. Anyways, almost all of those are producing and assume that we're making money just by making mixed rare earth oxides. Our concentrator would take that as a feedstock and then start separating those into individual elements and then reducing them to metal, which is then ready for the industrial uses and manufacturing uses in the country. So not only would we basically assume that role, we could fill that role and fund it and get it starting and up off the ground with the resources that we know we have, and then start bringing in other resources as time goes on. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank all of you. We're going to start with our questions now. And Dr. Z, I'm going to continue right where you stopped. As we, in West Virginia, we've seen all the leachate and what it does to our streams. We've seen Cheat River is probably the one that got hit the hardest. And how much money have we spent trying to get Cheat River back in a productive stream? It's been unbelievable. But with that, as you're going to be processing this and extracting these rare earth minerals, are you all basically treating the water before it goes back to? Is that all part of the process?
Yes, it is.
So the water that you're basically capturing it coming off of these mines, okay? And I'm anxious, and I know that Senator Heinrich and everyone from the West, as far as on hard rock mining, we've been in a lot of discussions. This is something that could be unbelievable because these mines have already been there. They've already been polluting. They've been causing a lot of problems all over the country. Have you all identified, have we done inventory and identified how much potential is there? And how is it possible for us, first of all, I don't think we'd have to get, the permitting process shouldn't be hard for us to go back in and clean up what you got. It's not a new mine permit. It's not all the bonding that goes on to it, because a lot of the bonds have been forfeited. We're taking away the obligations they've had, made it almost impossible, that bankrupted a lot of companies. So I understand the whole business chain of this thing. The bottom line is, this is the quickest way. What type of production are you talking about that we can meet the needs of America? Because we got an insatiable appetite right now for rare earth minerals. Could this be 10%, 50%?
I think we've identified in some of the surveys that we've done for DOE something like 1.5 tons per day to 3 tons per day.
Off of what? Off of?
Hard rock and coal in the United States.
Both.
Yeah, so that comes to about, yes. So just in terms of rare earth elements, if you start adding, there's almost an identical amount of cobalt and nickel. So for every ton of rare earth we produce a ton of cobalt, another ton of nickel, and then maybe 20 times that amount in manganese. These could be manganese mines if you really wanted to look at it that way.
So what does that come out to as far as our consumption?
Oh, that's about 5 to 10%. Yes. So it's not going to handle probably all of the rare earths needs, but it would get the industry started, and then it would provide that central.
Is this the quickest way for us to get in the business?
Pardon?
This is the quickest way for us to get in the business?
Yeah, absolutely, because these are all permitted sites. So they're all under Clean Water Act. They're all under SMACRA permits.
How much money have you seen us direct towards this?
Well, so far, my institute has gotten something like $11 million from the federal government and another $4 million from the industry as cost share.
To prove the concept?
Yes.
But you've proven that now. You're going from basically concept to commercial.
Correct. And so we will be producing mixed rare earth oxides of about 99% purity. We've already done this in the lab. We'll be doing that out at our pilot plant near Mount Storm by midsummer this year.
Unbelievable. We need to take a field trip, guys. Next of all, I repeatedly said that we need to strengthen our supply chains at home by increasing domestic production of all energy minerals, which we've been talking about here. I know it doesn't make sense to mine every single thing here, and we can use what we already have. My thing, Dr. Fortier, if I may say this, it matches up with the whole idea that a few of us have been talking about, which is the North American Energy Alliance. And basically, we should be looking at the North America as one of the energy juggernauts of the world. If we have seamless between us and Canada especially, and hopefully to get Mexico in the fray. How do you evaluate the supply risk of these allies as opposed to somewhere like Russia or China, what we're into right now?
Thank you for that question, Senator Manchin. That's a very important issue. We take into account the ability and willingness of trade partners to supply in our critical mineral screening methodology. And clearly, trade with reliable trade partners makes it a lot safer and less and more secure. We've actually published work on looking at net import alliance through a North American trade block filter, and it markedly reduces our import reliance for commodities basically across the board. We published a study in 2018 on this. We are now in the process of updating that with our Canadian counterparts in the Geological Society of Canada.
If I could, and Ms. Wolf, we might want to chime in on this. Have we evaluated basically the amount of critical minerals that we have in the North American continent that could be accessed if we had this alliance?
I'm sure the U.S. Geological Survey and Dr. Fortier, yes, has calculated that amount. And I think that working together with allies like Canada could be incredibly strategic, especially in the short term for the United States. They're building up all of this infrastructure there. We could pool resources. They also have a very heavy focus on this midstream production that I mentioned in my remarks, on battery component production and on material.
We have a total reliance right now. I didn't know it was this critical that we have with titanium and palladium and also uranium from Russia. Have you looked at the deposits we have in North America? Can we offset that?
We do resource assessments of mineral commodities across the board. We have looked at the Russia issue and provided data and input to the administration, to Congress, and to other executive branch agencies. Because of the sensitive nature of some of the discussions, we would prefer to comment that on in a different setting.
I would definitely talk to you about that. We could go to a closed session and have you come in and explain to us where the critical elements are and what the risk we're running right now if we don't jump into the game.
Be happy to do that,
With
Senator.
that, I'll turn to Senator Brasso for his questions.
Well, thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Melby, 2018, Department of Interior included uranium on its list of critical minerals. You mentioned in your testimony critical minerals and uranium. Last month, the Department of Interior reversed course and decided to exclude uranium from its list of critical minerals. The department made the decision even though the same legal definition of critical minerals applied. I also note that between 2018 and 2021, the Departments of Energy and Commerce identified uranium as a critical and an essential mineral. So, in your view, what happened?
Senator, it's bewildering. I think uranium meets the definition of critical mineral perhaps as well as can be. I mean, you have a national security implications, you have energy security implications, we have fuel and non-fuel uses, which obviously caused us to put uranium on the list in 2018, I think at the urging of the Department of Defense, and for it to be removed at a time when I think everyone in the world is looking at nuclear energy and uranium as a strategic commodity. I think we've just headed in the wrong direction there because it does impact the permitting, licensing in the infrastructure bill. I think it gave expedited permitting and licensing to critical minerals, so it may mean the difference between mines being brought into production in months or a couple of years or several years or 10 years down the road. So it really does have an impact on our national security and energy security.
Along those lines, let me follow up because a few years ago, Westinghouse entered into an agreement to fuel Ukraine's nuclear reactors. Now, these are Russian-built reactors that are now using American fuel. So as we look to wean Europe off of Russian energy, are there additional opportunities for us in the United States and our companies to provide fuel for Russian-built reactors around the world?
Well, it's a very timely question. I just returned from Prague last night, where I was attending the U.S. nuclear trade mission to the Czech Republic, and along with U.S. companies like Westinghouse, NuScale, TerraPower, and we had the privilege of being observers in a ministerial meeting 2 days ago where the energy ministers from countries all the way from the Baltics through Central Europe, all the way down into Bulgaria and Greece, were meeting to discuss the challenges that they're facing and cooperation that they can engage in together and with the United States to help them make their energy transition. They really face a dilemma because they're largely dependent on coal-fired electricity in those countries. The European Union is pushing them to transition away from that, but at the same time, it puts their reliance on natural gas from Russia. And so those Russian reactors that are operating not just in Ukraine, but Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, other countries, Westinghouse took the step with Ukraine even before the invasion to come up with fuel designs that Westinghouse can make the fuel for Russian reactors. And that opens these countries up to supplies from the West and stop their reliance on Russia. But perhaps
I'm going to need to move on with that. Could you sum that up? Because
the most compelling argument was made by the Deputy Energy Minister of Ukraine, Deputy Secretary Demchenkov, who nobody's impacted more than they are with what's going on right now. He pleaded to the European countries and the United States to stop the imports of Russian uranium immediately, not 3 months or 3 years from now, but immediately, given its impact on the war in Ukraine.
Thank you. Ms. Padilla, I'd like to move to you on, there's a chart that we're starting to hold up here. This is a chart, this depicts all of the steps necessary to permit a mine on federal land in Nevada. This is what you need. These are the steps to permitting a federal land, a mine on federal land in Nevada. It includes both federal and state and local requirements. It's like a Gordian knot. The orange boxes, they show the federal permitting process. Green is the state requirements. Blue are the local requirements. The orange boxes appear throughout the entire process. On average, it takes 10 years to permit a mine in the United States. Contrast the average time it takes to permit a mine in Canada and Australia, both of which have high environmental standards, high safety standards, is 2 to 3 years. Now, is it fair to say that this overly complex and long permitting process is actually the single largest roadblock to additional mineral production in the United States?
Thank you, Senator. That's a terrific question. And I would start by adding that there's no spots on this chart that show the many times you have to go back to the beginning and start over, at least for projects like ours, and the many places where arbitrary decisions can come into play that shift the dynamic of this chart. This is a challenge for every project in this country, and it highlights how and where we can get stuck to create that 10-year timeline or longer. I definitely agree that we need better coordination, both between the state and federal agencies, as well as guardrails around the permitting and NEPA process to ensure that they are done fairly and with regulatory certainty within a period of time.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Maybe we could give this to Senator King for his birthday present for today.
You know, today is Senator King's birthday.
Put this
Happy
up
birthday, Senator. And we're not going to sing because nobody out here can do it.
Today is also Patrick Leahy's birthday, and I made a calculation this morning that the two of us together go back to the Lincoln administration. That's a fact.
That's very appropriate because our mining law was written when Ulysses S. Grant was president.
Now, the hard rock mining law.
Yes, exactly, and I'll get to that. Thank you, Chairman.
Senator Heinrich.
You know, as I sit here listening to the need to streamline our mining laws, I can't help but think of the tens of thousands of abandoned hard rock mines that still are strewn across watersheds in states like mine. And I want to show you the flip side of this, which is just a few years back when a accident occurred on the Animas River. And the Animas drains into the San Juan River. It's the source of irrigation and drinking water and recreation for thousands of folks. This photo, that's the current president of the Navajo Nation there. Their irrigators were particularly impacted. And when you get it wrong, I would just ask you, would you want to drink that water? Would you want to irrigate with that water? There's an enormous amount of heavy metals that get released when that was a blowout. So, as I said, the mining law we're talking about was developed and written in 1872. There were only 37 states in the Union at that time. Most of us on this committee actually represent states that were still territories. I still do. In fact, my state is 40 years younger than the mining law. So as we sit here talking about how to open new mines, mine pollution is still leaking into streams and rivers across the West. It kills fish, and it renders water unfit for drinking and irrigation. Most of us in the West are highly water dependent, and we just don't have the quantities of water that people in the East take for granted. With regard to uranium, and we were a major uranium producer, uranium mining and milling sites still leach radioactive waste into our groundwater in New Mexico. And in fact, some of my constituents from Laguna Pueblo live just down the road from what was the world's largest open pit uranium mine. It is still barely reclaimed. Water samples taken by the EPA from a nearby stream just last year show uranium levels 16 times higher than the safe level. We simply can't continue to use a permissive law written 150 years ago to govern how companies develop minerals on public land. So if we want a modern mining permit process, I think it's fair to say we also need a modern mining law. We need a royalty to capture fair value for the taxpayers, as these are public resources. We need a reclamation fee. We need a process to protect the places that just aren't appropriate for development, whether that's the headwaters of the Pecos or the watershed around the boundary waters. And above all, what we really need is dedicated funding to clean up abandoned mines so that accidents like this, and this is not an anomaly in my state. We've had multiple accidents on the Animas, which also impacted Colorado. I remember the first time I ever talked to Governor Hickenlooper was as a result of this spill. We've had it happen on the Pecos. The Red River is still recovering from the impacts to the Red River. So as the chairman can attest, and he alluded to this a few minutes ago, all of these things are already in place for coal development, for oil and gas development. Hard rock mines are the only industrial use allowed on our public lands that has none of these public safeguards in place. So mining's been good to me. My father did exploration for Anaconda copper. My grandfather mined at Battle Mountain for gold. And I agree that we need new sources of minerals that are necessary for all of these technologies. But I don't think we'll get them with the same old mining law because local communities won't give them the social license until they know that their water is safe. So I would just make the case that if you want a better mining permit process, let's also write a better mining law. Now, with that, I wanted to ask you, Ms. Padilla, is the Twin Metals mine in the same watershed as the Boundary Waters Canoe area wilderness?
The project is located, Senator, within the Rainy River watershed.
Yeah, which is the same watershed. Is it above or below the Boundary Waters?
It is south of the Boundary Waters.
Which puts it above it in the watershed, correct?
The mine project, the hydrology is really interesting in the area. So we're about 20 river miles away from the Boundary Waters Canoe area wilderness, and our hydrology connects to about 1% of the lakes within the Boundary Waters.
When the Minneapolis Star-Tribune asked you if there was zero risk to the Boundary Waters as a result, what they reported, and please correct it if it's incorrect, is that you said that's not a fair question. Is that accurate? And if it is accurate, why would it not be a fair question?
Yeah, it was a much more nuanced response than what was printed in the paper, Senator. It's a good question. I mean, these are industrial activities. Every human activity involves risk. And so I think when we ask simple questions and expect a simple answer, that's a problem. When I get into a car, I choose whether to put on a seatbelt. I choose whether to take that risk, and there's laws in place to determine whether I should do that or not. So when we're talking about, whether an industrial project has any risk of impacting anything, certainly we have that risk. But
I'll wrap this up, Mr. Chair, because I've taken a lot of time here. But Dr. Z, I know you're an expert on acid mine drainage. This kind of underground mining in a wet environment above a place like the Boundary Waters in a watershed, is that risky, and is that different than dry mining?
Oh, well, it's by definition. By definition, it'll be wet enough to generate acid mine drainage. Right. So unless you put a plastic cover over the entire, all of the potentially acid-producing rock on the site, it will produce some acid. Yes. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'd like to make a personal privilege here of introducing Senator Glenn Jeffries from West Virginia. He's a state senator who I've worked with very closely, does a great job, and he's been very supportive of these programs. He's pushing it in the state, too. And thanks, Glenn, for being here. Appreciate you, buddy. Okay. And now we have Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all of you for being here. Mr. Melby, I'd like to start with you, if that's okay. I'm worried about our domestic reliance on imported uranium, specifically and especially Russian imported uranium. I think this poses a significant strategic risk to the United States. I also worry that the recent decision by the Biden administration to remove uranium from its critical minerals list is something that could have very real, harmful, lasting consequences. Mr. Melby, what kind of consequences do you think we ought to anticipate as a result of that short-sighted decision by the U.S. Geological Survey?
Yeah, well, uranium is the source of fuel for our largest source of carbon-free energy, over 55% of our carbon-free energy, 20% of our electricity. It's also the fuel for our naval reactors and our 100-plus reactors and more than 80 aircraft carriers and submarines. So I think we've become a little lackadaisical about the supply of uranium, and I think on the commercial side of nuclear energy, I think it was more of a commercial preference to just diversify and purchase uranium from Russia and Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. It wasn't an imperative. We have over 1 billion pounds of known and likely resources in the United States. We have the highest environmental standards, health, safety, and environment. The injustices that occurred in New Mexico in the 1950s as part of the weapons program and the government's obligation, they need to address those because they were injustices and they bear no resemblance to the mining industry that we have today. We have 21st century standards of technologies, health, safety, environment. So we've got to pay attention to our uranium industry. Countries like Russia, China are taking, they're playing the long game. They're acquiring resources all around the world, places like Namibia and Africa, and but we're fortunate. We have abundant resources here in New Mexico, or in the United States and Canada. So we should make the best use of that, and we have the ability to do that.
We have the ability, and notwithstanding that ability, we've chosen to put ourselves in a position in which we're taking upwards of 46% of uranium consumed in America from Russia and its close affiliates. Does that strike you, and should it strike me, as us putting ourselves in a position fairly analogous to that of Germany relying on a supply of Russian natural gas?
Yeah, I mean, Germany put themselves in their position with the energy policies that they took, and it's caused them to be over-reliant on Russian gas. But, we've done the same thing here in nuclear energy with uranium from Russia, but we don't have to. It was a commercial preference, not a supply imperative. So it'll be easy for us. It won't be painless, and it won't be without some cost, but we need to stand up Western industries as quickly as we can to get ourselves off of Russian uranium.
Dr. Fortier, in determining whether a mineral should be listed as critical, the USGS creates an ability to supply index. This is known as the ASI. The data supplied for the USGS's ability to supply index comes from the Fraser Institute's Policy Perception Index, and that's an index that assesses political stability, security, and other factors. Now, here's the rub. The Fraser Institute concludes, to say it concludes absurdly is a vast understatement, but it listed Russia right above Utah in terms of its investment attractiveness. Now, if you look closely, however, you'll see that this ranking was made only on the basis of somewhere between 5 and 9 voluntary responses to their survey. Dr. Fortier, do you think that between 5 and 9 unreported responses to a survey provide sufficient qualitative bases for determining the likelihood for critical mineral supply disruption?
Thank you for that question, Senator Lee. Certainly, there are data limitations in any kind of modeling effort. We use whatever data we have available to us and whatever best data are available to us, but we really don't control how those data are produced. We have to use what's available.
Right. And what's available here strikes me as problematic, and there are external manifestations of this. According to the 5 to 9 responses that the Fraser Institute received, Russia scored above 60% in terms of political stability of the sort encouraging investment. Again, that was above my home state of Utah, but it wasn't just Utah. It was also Montana and Washington and Minnesota and Colorado and other states, many of which are represented here on this committee. Would you agree with this assessment that Utah and the other states I've mentioned are less politically stable than Russia?
Senator, I think it's important to distinguish what we have done and what we have not done. We are not disputing the facts about uranium supply and demand.
I'm not suggesting you're disputing them. I'm disputing your characterization that my state is somehow less politically stable than Russia.
And that's certainly not a position we're taking. Right? We removed uranium from the critical minerals list because the definition of a critical mineral in the Energy Act of 2020 changed. That's why. It has nothing to do with whether uranium meets the criteria that are otherwise stated in that definition, but the definition, which had language inserted specifically excluding fuel minerals from consideration, is what we are responding to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I see my time has expired.
I feel like you might be around for the second round. Senator Heinrich.
Yeah, I just want to quickly point out that the industry and the mine that I referenced operated long after the government's nuclear program and operated in the private sector supplying the energy industry.
Thank you, Senator. Senator King, the birthday boy.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of my favorite sayings of Mark Twain is that history doesn't always repeat itself, but it usually rhymes. And in this case, I'm thinking back to the predecessor in my Senate seat, Edmund Muskie of Maine, who wrote the Clean Water Act. And the Clean Water Act passed in 1970 after immense effort by Senator Muskie unanimously. Can you imagine? The Clean Water Act passed the United States Senate unanimously. And it seems to me that what we're talking about today is a solvable problem. We need these minerals. We need to cut off our dependency on other countries that are unreliable or even hostile. To me, that's just common sense. We also need to protect our watersheds and our rivers and our natural resources and our communities. This is an engineering problem. And I have worked in energy permitting. I've been an advocate for development over my life. In fact, next year marks the 40th year since I went into the alternative energy business. And what I said when I was governor of Maine is I want the strongest, most far-reaching environmental laws in the country, and the most timely and predictable permitting process. I don't think the permitting process itself should be used as a weapon to stop a project. We need to, but I agree, I find myself in the unusual position of agreeing with Senator Barrasso. By the way, I think that's one of the most effective uses of visual data that I've ever seen, and it really does make an important point. We've got to have one-stop permitting. We've got to have coordination between the state and the federal government. This doesn't mean lowering the standards. It doesn't mean skipping steps. It doesn't mean avoiding difficult issues. But Ms. Wolf, am I on the right track here? I mean, it just seems to me this is in the nature of a scientific and an engineering problem, and we should be able to solve it so that we can permit necessary projects for national security within a reasonable period of time.
I couldn't agree with you more, Senator King, and thank you for your work and your interest on this issue. I was so like, wow, when you held up that chart earlier, but I really do think that our regulatory regime is really one of our greatest strengths as well. We want to make sure that the energy transition is responsible and clean, and we do think that doing that within the United States and among like-minded nations will help to achieve that. As you mentioned, the technology is rapidly advancing, and we are able to do things much more cleanly than we have in the past. But what we also need to recognize is that we need much more robust and meaningful community participation on the front end as well to help make sure that we can communicate to people, and that's partly what I'm trying to do here today, is that we really do need these things. It should be a bipartisan issue. And so as humans, nothing that we do is zero impact. So how can we make sure that we can have as responsible of an impact as possible? And I think that, it's not cutting corners. Streamlining the permitting process is required, but, maintaining these high standards that we have in the United States and trying to figure out just how virtuous are we and are there any loopholes and can we improve is important.
Well, I think that you use the phrase, nothing we do is zero impact, and I think you use that phrase as well. And that's important. Well, the one thing I've learned in energy over 40 years is there's no free lunch. Everything has a cost and an impact, and if you want wind power, you're going to have to look at them on top of the ridges, and if you want solar, a lot of farm fields are going to disappear. And you're going to have the minerals, and either the choice is we import them from possibly hostile countries, or we develop them ourselves. I think the chairman is absolutely right. Within North America, from friendly countries, we can develop a supply chain. We don't have to be entirely dependent on indigenous resources. But we've got to recognize that, and the environmental community has to recognize, if they want electrification, they've got to understand that the materials necessary to make that a possibility there are going to be impacts, and the question is, how do we minimize them, protect against them, and develop a rational permitting system where the system itself doesn't become an impediment to the development of the word is critical resources.
I agree. I think that they need to be thought of as clean energy land uses.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. And now we have Senator Daines here. Senator Daines is here.
I'm behind this stack of paper, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, you should have seen it before.
Yeah. Well, we all have our horror stories. I'm going to unpack this one from Montana. First of all, behind me is the permitting timeline for the Rock Creek Mine located in the northwestern part of Montana in Sanders County. It's Crick in Montana, there, Chairman King there. So this started in 1987. This is a lather, rinse, repeat cycle. You can see what happens here. We go through the permitting process, the draft EIS, the permits get finished, then we have the legal challenge. This started in 1987, by the way. This is 2022 here. They finished it again, legally challenged. This is 35 years. And this is so far the environmental reports that have been generated. In 1987, when this process started, Ronald Reagan was president. In fact, that was the year he stood before the Brandenburg Gate and said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. I would kindly submit, please, to the courts, to the regulators, please tear down this wall and allow us to move forward with a mine after some 35 years of court battles and regulatory battles. Doing it the right way in a state, by the way, and a corner of my state that has one of the highest poverty levels in Montana. In fact, I met with a couple up there several years ago. We were talking about the loss of their natural resource industry, the loss of their timber industry, and they sadly said, Senator, what we have here in this beautiful part of Montana is poverty with a view. So there's a lot at stake here about the economic activity, the tax revenues to save these counties that are losing their population because there is no work, there's no tax base, not to mention we've got an ability here to generate more made-in-America minerals. Let me put that in perspective. This permitting process has been ongoing for 7 presidents. We've had 9 presidential elections since the mine was originally proposed. This is unacceptable. And I wish we could bring the folks from the county here that could plead before this body of Democrats and Republicans and ask, when is this nightmare, frankly, going to end? I'll tell you who's making a lot of money. It's the lawyers who's making probably the most money on this and probably some consultants. With every new permit comes more frivolous litigation from anti-mining groups. Their philosophy is leave it in the ground. On one hand, we have the Biden administration trying to block permitting of new oil and gas leases on federal lands. At the same time, you have these woke green groups trying to block domestic mining of the materials and the metals that are needed for renewable energy development. So what are we left with? Under President Biden and these far-left environmental groups and woke judges, we can't produce traditional energy on federal lands. We also can't mine the materials needed to produce renewable energy. And I'm not opposed to renewables. Let's think of renewables as additive to our portfolio as this transition occurs, not replacing. And if there's one case study to be made, it's look what happened to Europe and the position they put themselves in. We cannot let America get to that point. Increasing domestic mining, like the Rock Creek Mine, will help bolster energy security. It's going to help our local communities. It's going to help people. The Forest Service predicted that this mine would result in 600 Montana jobs. They'd be a stable economic driver, and the county for more than 30 years. It's virtually a generation. This is an area that desperately needs these jobs and revenue. We are dangerously dependent on China for the minerals and the metals that run our economy and our national defense. In fact, of the 50 critical minerals, 31 are imported from China. This never-ending cycle of permitting and litigation must stop if we ever plan to reduce our dependence on China and foreign adversaries for minerals and metals. Over the years, we've seen China increasing mining, the United States becoming more dependent on imports. In 1995, the United States was 100% import reliant on 8 minerals. In 2021, that just increased to 17. It's a disturbing trend. For the sake of our kids and our grandkids and the security of this nation, it's being fueled by lengthy permitting and constant litigation from green groups. Mr. Melby, can you discuss the impacts of litigation on developing new mines and how this puts the U.S. at a disadvantage to countries like China and Russia?
Yeah, well, Senator, again, anyone who's been in mining in the United States has experience like you've shown very explicitly with this stack of documents. Again, I just want to remind everyone that the United States has the most robust, thorough permitting and licensing process. Modern mining in 2022, understandably, and we accept being put through strong regulatory steps to bring a mine into production, but we just want it predictable and we want it transparent. And if you meet all the steps, you should be granted the license to mine. And I mean, our most successful track record, I think, was permitting a mine in the state of Wyoming in just over 6 years. And that was a huge success. But we didn't face, much opposition to the mine in the form of legal challenges. But we find that a lot of those challenges, too, ignore the local communities, whether it's northern Minnesota or it's South Texas or it's the Powder River Basin of Wyoming. These are people's real lives here. They're not some esoteric argument about mining or not mining. If we don't do it here, it's going to be undertaken in places like the Congo or in Africa or South America where they don't share our values for the environment, for tribal peoples. We have protections for all of those things in our current regulatory structure in the United States, and we just need to enforce those and streamline them as much as we can.
Thank you. I'm over my time, but everybody I've spoken to involved in these operations, they want to comply with the regulations. They want to do it the right way. The modern mining practices do it the right way. We're better off doing it here in America in terms of global stewardship than outside our borders. And by the way, the difference here between perhaps Montana and other countries is welcome to the Ninth Circuit Court. But thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Wyden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. There is lots going on here. And
you missed a good show so far.
Many of the technologies that are going to move us to the next generation of clean energy products rely on critical minerals. So it is essential to start building the supply here at home and reduce our country's dependence on foreign-produced minerals and, in turn, wean ourselves off of foreign energy. And reducing that dependence on foreign minerals and energy is as much a national security issue as it is an environmental question. So towards this end, I recently introduced S3783, my American Energy Development and Growth Enhancement Act, which would expand access to critical minerals here in the United States and create what I think are clearly good-paying red, white, and blue jobs. The bill does not deal with mining leases, but would provide opportunities to expand the processing and manufacturing of critical minerals and aid the cleanup of existing mining sites. And folks, we can do this. We can tap these extraordinary domestic resources without throwing the environmental values we feel strongly about in the trash can. So what I'd like to do is just get you, Ms. Wolf, on the record on this point. Mentioned, we all understand the need for critical minerals and dealing with supply chains here in our country. That's what the EDGE Act does. What are your thoughts on this, and what would increase access to domestic critical mineral supplies and support for processing through companies that care about innovation, as you do, as I do, I think our colleagues all do, that produce cutting-edge battery and clean energy technologies?
Thank you so much, Senator Wyden, and thank you so much for your work on that bill, which we very much support. So, as you say, this race for the future isn't just a race to control the raw materials. It's really a race to control the innovation, expertise, and intellectual property that comes along with the downstream industries that flow from our ability to have secure access to those material resources. We want to be, so it doesn't really matter where you dig something up at this point because it all has to get sent to China to be processed anyway. But additionally, if if we only focus on building up processing facilities, we need to be thinking about what are we processing, and also, once we've processed the material, who are we selling that stuff to? There is no silver bullet right now. We have to be focusing on the entirety of the supply chain to make sure that these renewable energy industries and high technology innovation industries in our auto sector are not hollowed out. Right now, even if we have processing, we are not making the battery components, those anodes and cathodes, as I mentioned in my remarks. You'd have to send that processed material to China to be processed, to be made into those battery components. So it is this vital midstream, Senator Wyden, and thank you for the question.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the support for our EDGE Act, and I would just say, colleagues, I think, and Senator Manchin and I talk about this, this issue, all of us do, I think that this effort with respect to domestic focus on minerals is a good complement to the Clean Energy for America Act. You know, the Clean Energy for America Act, colleagues, we basically took the tax code as it relates to energy and threw it in the trash can. And what we said going forward is we're going to have a technology-neutral approach, and then we're going to say for the first time, the more you reduce carbon emissions, the bigger your tax savings. So we're all in here in terms of trying to tap these kinds of opportunities. That's what a technology-neutral approach is all about. That's what the effort in terms of freeing ourselves from this dependence on foreign sources of minerals is all about. I support the kind of ideas that are being offered today and in this committee, and this is priority business. And if anything, what the conflict in Ukraine has highlighted is the urgency of this, you know, shaking free of this dependence on foreign supplies in particular is critical. And in so many instances, I'm running back to the Finance Committee, we see people going the other way. Mexico is walking back right now its commitments to renewable energy. So we got a lot of work to do. Look forward to working with all of you and our colleagues here in the Energy Committee on both sides of the aisle. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. And now we have Senator Langford.
Senator Manchin, thank you. The witnesses, thanks very much for being here. This is an incredibly important conversation. It's interesting as we go back and forth across the dais here, that it's this perception that Republicans are all trying to get rid of all permitting and just rape the land and strip it, and Democrats are trying to be able to protect everything. I don't think that's really where anyone is on this, on either side of it. Reasonable permitting process. We all live in these areas. Senator Heinrich, you were talking about some of the challenges there. Pitcher, Oklahoma is considered the most toxic place in America. It was a lead mine for 100 years. It's still the largest Superfund site, and literally we've had to evacuate everyone from the entire town. It's a ghost town now. All buildings are there. Everyone's pulled up as we try to deal with. The way we used to do mining was terrible. It was expedient. It destroyed the environment around it. No one wants to go back to that. Nobody. But we've got to figure out how to be able to do this. When I talk to mining companies, I'm interested here with some of your insight today and with Senator Daines' comment. It's always about why would you do mining? Why would you even try it now? When you go through the whole long process, but then at the end of it, someone can sue you and it just delays everything out and it ends up never being answered. If there's a small group that doesn't want any mining at all there, regardless of what the national need is, how do you get around that and how do you deal with it? And so there are major issues that we have to address that are hard questions. How do we make sure that we actually do this environmentally friendly, but how do we make sure we actually get projects done and we have the private sector? Otherwise, every project's going to have to be a federal project, and we all know what that's going to mean. We have 12,000 plus mines that are actually happening in America right now, and a lot of them are doing it extremely well. So we've got to be able to figure out how to be able to balance this out. Dr. Fortier, I want to ask you about the mapping. I talked about the Earth mapping, the Earth MRI. I love the name of it, by the way. There was a time period when this was all moving, and we'd actually map more of Afghanistan than we had of the United States. I would assume we're caught up on that. Where are we? When will this project be done?
Yes, thank you, Senator. The Earth MRI project is, I think, a fundamentally important initiative, and we are very appreciative of the influx.
So when will it be done?
I don't think I can give you an end date, but what I can say without fear of contradiction is that the money that has been injected by the bipartisan infrastructure law will vastly accelerate that process.
So is that 20 years? Is that 5 years?
I don't know the answer to that. I can perhaps get one of our people that run that project to give you a better idea what the timeline is, but I would not hazard a guess. It's a big initiative.
It's a big initiative.
And it
but it's
is
gonna be helpful long
accelerating
term.
with the influx of funding.
So I have a question that's been brought to me before, and that is about processing minerals. We really talk a lot about the mining, but the processing part is another whole step, and that's very significant. Obviously, there are environmental challenges around the processing as well as around the mining, and both can be handled well. There's a question that's been brought to me before of, can we do the processing on a brownfield site? So there are unique challenges, obviously working in a brownfield site already with environmental challenges there. But are there ways to be able to move the processing to a location that's a brownfield site already, and to say, while we're working on the other environmental issues that are here already, we also have something else that we're trying to be able to manage as well? Is that faster or slower to do that? I'm not going to ask either of you to commit to it, but initial impression, Ms. Padilla, initial impression on that.
Thank you, Senator. I think we need to look at all of these options because siting facilities like that are difficult. So
Right.
processing facilities by themselves, if you're utilizing a site that's already been heavily industrialized, you're likely going to have an easier time through permitting.
Right. Shmabi, what do you think?
Yeah, and one of the advantages of the uranium fuel cycle is the energy density of uranium. And so we don't have a proliferation of a lot of mines and a lot of processing facilities, but clearly it's easier to expand on a site that already has the community acceptance and everything going forward. So yes, it is a easier path forward, but we still have to go through the steps.
Right, there's still lots of steps to go through. We're just trying to be able to find, we've got to get practical solutions in this process of how do we actually do some of these things. And I think what I'm throwing out is this even an option, something that we should consider to be able to walk through this? I'm going to stick to Joe Manchin's term of Dr. Z and be able to go from there. Yes. So my question to you is, in Oklahoma, multiple other states that are around that are doing oil and gas development, they've got produced water that's coming out. The produced water that's coming out in multiple areas, they've found lithium in it. Have you done experimentation research on the issue about produced water coming out of oil and gas wells and actually producing lithium, or any of you tracking that as research?
Yes, Senator. We have a project with the Department of Energy where we're looking at the produced water coming out of the Marcellus and Utica unconventional formations. And we generally find, we've looked at lithium, we generally find the concentrations between 80 and 120 milligrams per liter. There's a lot of other in the matrix, a lot of other things in the matrix, but I just talked to, the other day, a developer of a lithium brine development project in California, and we were comparing notes on the water quality, and it's not that much different in terms of being a sodium chloride dominated water. Being able to extract the lithium from that, we did not find at current prices, and we did this study a couple years ago, that it was cost effective. When I talked to the brine developer in California, he told me that they like 200 to 400 milligrams per liter, which is about twice what we're getting. So to answer your question briefly.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, thanks.
Thank you. Senator Cantwell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you and Ranking Member Barrasso for holding this hearing. I think it's fair to say the committee has been ahead of the curve in recognizing the importance of critical minerals to our economy, to national security, and to our energy future. The committee has done some good work stemming from Senator Murkowski and I collaborating early on an energy package all the way to the most recent infrastructure bill. But clearly we need to do more faster and we need to do more innovation. One of the issues that we're working on is the innovation bill. My colleague, House Energy and Commerce colleague Kathy McMorris-Rogers has made it clear she'd like to see a critical minerals element to the package. And so I think when you think about critical minerals, it's important for our R&D for various technologies in clean energy specifically. Lots of the products and services in clean energy will require these critical minerals, so I hope that we can leverage our expertise at our DOE labs and work towards these issues. Becoming less reliant on global critical minerals will really, I think, require some out-of-the-box thinking. Chairman Manchin has highlighted the possibility of extracting critical minerals from coal ash. One example from my state, on a tour of the Pacific Northwest Laboratory Marine Science Lab in Sequim, I was told there was promising research in developing new approaches to extract critical minerals from seawater. So I think that included elements such as uranium, lithium, and cobalt. So something I hope that our labs can take a look at. So I wanted to ask you, Ms. Wolf, the traditional critical mineral extraction, I don't believe that's going to be enough to get us to end our dependence. So on China's imports and rapidly scale up renewables and EVs, can you share some thoughts on innovative ways that we should be looking at critical minerals here at home?
Absolutely, Senator Cantwell, and thank you very much for the question, because I think that's an important one. In the United States, one of our greatest strengths is our innovation. And what we have right now is a relatively older industry really bashing heads with brand new cutting-edge technology. It's sort of an interesting culture clash, I think. But one of the ways that we don't want to just be trying to catch up with China in this regard. We need to find out a way to leapfrog them, and I think that, again, our innovation base is the way to do that. In particular, I think that we need to work with our national labs and to partner with industry to figure out more innovative ways to make mineral processing faster, cheaper, and cleaner outside of China, so within the United States and among like-minded nations. Right now, their processes are very traditional. We have some very forward-thinking mineral processors here in the United States. One, Urbix in Arizona, is doing clean graphite processing in a light industrial zone in Mesa, Arizona, which is fairly fascinating. They're not associated with one single mine, so following that China angle, I think that's something that we should be investing in and doing more of here.
Okay, and I noticed the president's made an executive order here, so the resources could be flowing as well. So what particular areas or minerals do you think we should focus on in the innovation side that would be most helpful?
In the innovation side, and thank you again for the question. So at SAFE, we are particularly interested in the battery metals, but also, we want to make sure as technologies rapidly change and the flavors of batteries rapidly change, that we have the holistic frameworks in place so that we're not just focusing on a couple key minerals at one time that could, in the next 10 years, not really be the dominant flavors or, chemistries, to be more formal, in the future. So, having those frameworks in place will be really important, but in the near term, 10 to 15 years for light-duty vehicles, we need those lithium-ion battery chemistry minerals.
Well, I think this is one of the reasons why just supply chain money in general, again, wearing a different hat for the commerce side of USICA, is about identifying in critical areas of U.S. Industry what are the supply chain needs. And so to me, getting that identified so that, as you say, we're not just doing one-off today, but looking at the complexity of the whole system. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
And we have now Senator Murkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Really appreciate this hearing this morning, as has been mentioned just most directly by Senator Cantwell. This committee's been looking at this issue and this vulnerability for a long, long time now, and it is good. It feels like everybody else is kind of waking up to our reality, that we've been raising the alarm or pounding the drum, and it seems like it just kind of echoes in this room and doesn't go beyond here. So it's important that we are aware and are focusing on it, and hopefully in a strong and a significant way. We talk about this transition, whether it's to electric vehicles, but if things are trending in the way that we see them trending now, the costs that will be that we will see as we try to develop new technologies, as we try to build out, for instance, the electric vehicle fleet. We're looking at projections now that the cost of an average EV could rise by $1,000 just because of the nickel prices. Batteries could cost more than 25% more because of the increase in lithium carbonate prices. So people are getting the message. They say, I want to go to an electric vehicle, and then they look at it and say, how am I going to do this? Why are they doing this? Who's to blame? Well, you used a terminology, Ms. Wolf, that I really appreciated. You said we can talk about acts of nature. That's where the resources are. We think that God's blessed us with a lot of that in Alaska, but the act of policy is what is inhibiting our ability to really do more and be more of a producer in this area. We have laid strong fundamentals through this committee with everything beginning from the Energy Act of 2020, which Dr. Fortier, you have mentioned, the American Mineral Security Act that Senator Manchin and I worked on, the REACT Act, the bipartisan infrastructure bill that puts funding to the authorization. We're doing all of this right, and I think that that's important. But then we have these inconsistencies with policy that just make no sense. In February, on the very same day that the President touted his progress on critical minerals, the very same day, Department of Interior pauses and suspends the right-of-way for the Ambler Access Project. This isn't even for a mine, mind you. This is a 200-mile-plus controlled access industrial road to provide access to this mineral district. It's about a 75-mile mineral belt, considered one of the world's largest undeveloped copper and zinc mineral belts. Well, if you can't get there, the resource is going to continue to sit there. I think we recognize that. That stack of paperwork that Senator Daines cited to, that lengthy schematic about how long it takes to process a mine, we can't even get to the beginning of starting a 10-year process because we can't get to it. So it's these inconsistencies and the conflict between where the resource is, that act of nature, and the act of policy. Well, we can control the policy side. And I think this is where we need to help move this forward. I want to ask a question to you, Dr. Fortier, about graphite. We have not produced in the U.S. at any significant scale since the 1950s. We're now 100% dependent on imports for natural graphite. 70% of those imports come from China. But we also know that both natural graphite, which Alaska has, we've got a significant project, Graphite One, but synthetic graphite, which states like West Virginia and Wyoming can produce, are both needed for the production of anode for lithium-ion batteries. So, and maybe, Ms. Wolf, maybe this is better directed to you, but in terms of rechargeable batteries, energy storage, are there applications that require all natural graphite or all synthetic graphite, or is it always a mix? Because I've been told, no, don't worry about the natural graphite. We'll be able to produce in synthetic, so we don't need it. Walk me through that.
Thank you very much for the question, Senator Murkowski, and thank you very much to you and Senator Cantwell for your dedicated work to this issue for a very long time. On battery chemistries, I might admit I just know a bit to be dangerous, so I'm happy to get back to you on that question, but I believe the answer is it can be both.
But perhaps more broadly, wouldn't you agree that if we're going to talk about really improving our mineral security, especially for battery minerals, we've got to have domestic production of graphite, natural graphite, synthetic graphite?
I certainly agree that domestic production will have to be a part of our equation when we're talking about national and economic security. I like to think of this issue in short-term and long-term terms. In the short term, yes, we see that we have a lot of these hurdles, and we want to make sure that we do things correctly here because, again, I think we see that as our strength. I think that we can work with our allies in the short term to get the things that we need to process it here, to build the battery components and other things here to get that downstream IP. But then also, I think that, it does make sense to also have enough of a material here to insulate ourselves from any supply shocks that we might have.
So, Mr. Chairman, we haven't talked as much about the processing side of this as I think is required for this. We're talking about where it's coming from. USGS is working on the mapping. We appreciate that. But when you think about the one processing facility that we're talking about here in Mountain Pass, DOD has just given a grant to help build that out. It kind of disturbs me to know that there's a Chinese interest there. I mean, it's not big, but 8% or thereabouts is something that I thought we were a little worried about that. I worry about the fact that we might have the resources here. We might be able to get around the lengthy permitting process and still be in a situation where we have to send it to China and then ask politely for them to send it back to us. So I would hope that we would have additional time here in this committee to talk about that aspect of how we get the stuff We can't take the rock and put it in the Tesla. I like the way you translated it for minerals for dummies here.
Thank you.
Senator Hickenlooper.
Let me just say that I, as a recovering geologist, enjoy this panel more than any, and as a volcanologist, almost all the critical minerals and rare earth elements in some way go back to a volcanic past. Let me start with Dr. Fortier, and anybody connected with the U.S. Geological Survey. You get my immediate acceptance, not to say you can't lose it, but immediate acceptance. I want to talk a little bit about the great horse manure crisis of 1894, where the Times of London reported that if the rate of growth continued, every street in London would be buried under 9 feet of horse manure within 50 years. And Kingsmill Bond of the Rocky Mountain Institute, a proud Colorado think tank, observed this analogy between then and today's critical mineral projections. And I think there's a temptation that we will meet the needs, the energy needs of 2050 with the technologies of today. And that's probably not going to happen. In reality, the radical improvements that are going to occur in technology and efficiency have been, I think you say, the hallmark of every technological revolution ever. So what are some of the lessons, quickly, because I've got a couple more questions, what are the lessons we can learn to avoid repeating modeling mistakes from the 19th century here in the 21st century, and how is USGS poised to help that happen?
Thank you for that question, Senator. It's a very good one. Clearly, predicting the future is hazardous at best. We recognize that critical mineral and mineral criticality evolves over time, and in fact, that is acknowledged in the Energy Act of 2020, which instructs us to review and revise the list no less than every 3 years. That is an acknowledgement that over time, what we now consider critical is likely to change. I think we have to try to stay ahead of these challenges and do the best we are able to see forward and anticipate impending disruptions to the supply chain.
Great. I couldn't agree more. And I've got other questions I'm going to send to you written. Now I want to just talk to Ms. Wolf and Ms. Patia, and I'm going to spare you all my normal static presentation on volcanic vesiculation, magmatic vesiculation. But I do think that we are in the midst of a great transition, with the energy transition at the forefront of this, and with each efficiency and technology improvement, I think mining and minerals are going to continue to play a pivotal role in this transition. Mining, critical minerals, clean energy technologies, all moving hand in hand, evolving together. That's how civilization has always progressed. How do you see the prospects for integrating innovative technologies into existing mining practices to maintain the standards that you've all recognized in terms of clean and sustainable? So how would you guys look at that?
Thank you, Senator. I think this is a time and an opportunity for us to incorporate really model mining practices as we move forward. We're doing that at Twin Metals in a number of different ways, through fully electrifying our mining fleet, utilizing the olivine in our tailings for carbon sequestration, no waste rock on the surface, and frankly, no potential for acid mine drainage at this mine. We've got integrated underground dry stack tailings, no dam, no tailings pond, no potential for a dam failure. All of those things combined mean that we can both protect the Boundary Waters Canoe area wilderness and provide regional economic stability for the area. And I think those innovations will continue.
Ms. Wolf?
Thank you, Senator. And I will just say I would have loved to hear the more technical spiel. I studied pegmatites, a type of igneous rock enriched in rare earth elements and lithium. So, hello from a fellow geologist. In terms of technological advances, if I can borrow a term from my colleague who's sitting behind me here, I think what we need is more robust federal investments in environmental R&D to partner with industry and to help make their processes cleaner and better. There are, mechanisms of automation that I've heard about where instead of digging a big open pit, if there's a vein like a pegmatite, you can have this little autonomous robot that goes through and just mines that vein. So things like that, thinking big again, and working public-private partnerships between the government and industry to make these things possible, I think is very important.
And I saw almost every head nodding as you were speaking. And I'm not sure they're talking about agreeing with your principle, which I hope and I think is what was, but there is something beautiful but just about the word pegmatite by itself. So anyway, I yield back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Now we have Senator Marshall.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. My first question for Dr. Fortier, talk about potash just for a second. Obviously, it was removed from the critical minerals list. We're facing a famine. The world is facing a famine this year, to some extent, much more so next year. My farmers are struggling already to get all the different fertilizer. Prices are through the roof. I think your notes, your graph mentioned that 93% of the potash is imported. Canada, a significant portion of that, Russia, and Belarus. Why was it removed from the critical mineral list, and how do we stand on that?
Thank you for that question, Senator. You are correct. We have high import reliance for potash. The bulk of our imports do come from Canada, and U.S. consumption last year was something on the order of half of what Canadian annual production was. And the annual production capacity in Canada is 3 times U.S. annual consumption. So there really is no reason in principle that we could not source all of our potash from Canada. They have some of the largest potash.
Okay, so you still stand by that decision? You don't think that other countries are going to be coming and taking Canadian potash since they can't get it from Belarus and Russia?
Certainly they will.
Okay, I'll move on to my next question. Stay with you, Dr. Fortier, if you don't mind. Kansas has many legacy mining pits, believe it or not. And we've done a wonderful job restoring them, some great bass fishing. Have you ever considered looking at the tailings in Kansas sites for sources of critical minerals?
Yes, there is an active initiative, and we are directed to further investigate potential for critical minerals from waste streams and do a national inventory of critical minerals in historic mine waste and tailings. That's, I think, a very positive development and has a lot of potential.
Great. Mr. Melby, I'll go to you next. Talk about nuclear fuels and specifically enriched nuclear fuels. One of my big concerns of the Iran treaty is, as I understand it, they'll take their super enriched uranium and sell it, give it to Russia. Already we're at their mercy a little bit. How can we delink ourselves from the Russian state-owned atomic energy company? Give us solutions. Talk about solutions, please.
Yeah, listen, the move to rely on about 20 to 25% of our enrichment needs in the United States was more of a commercial preference and not to beat up the utilities. It was a genuine step to diversify their fuel supplies into an international fuel cycle. But we've seen through the Iran sanctions issues with Rosatom's involvement in Iran. We're seeing it now with Ukraine and the invasion there, that a reliance on Russia just is problematic in so many ways. The high-assay, low-enriched uranium is even a more specific challenge because we can enrich to the normal levels.
So I understand the problem. You're preaching to the choir.
Yeah.
What's the solution?
We need to stand up our domestic fuel cycle, and that means uranium conversion and enrichment industries. I think some of the initiatives that have been done out of...
What's keeping us from doing that?
It's just the will to move forward, and I think
It's not regulatory, it's not the cost of doing business in the United States?
Well, I mean, we've talked about the chart that was presented earlier is a stumbling block for us to develop, but I mean, if we have a national will to have a domestic fuel cycle that we can support our own needs, energy independence is something that is a challenge for a lot of countries, but for us, we have the resources, we have the technology.
We've proven we can do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ms. Wolf, I want to move to you. This is a very broad question, and you may not like it. To mine critical minerals in the United States has an environmental impact. And if we would say that environmental impact is X, similar mining in China, the environmental impact of the way they mine, is it 2X, 5X, 10X, a range? Just take a shot in the dark. I won't quote you.
Thank you for the heads up, Senator, and thank you for the question. I don't think I can hazard a guess at the exact difference, but I would say again that our regulatory environment, our transparency in our system, and our ability for our citizens to seek recourse, should anything go awry, I think is something that is a pillar in the United States and something that is a benefit and a strength here. So that isn't really something that they have within the Chinese Communist Party. So, yes.
Would you agree there's a significant amount of environmental impact differences by the way we mine versus the way China mines?
I would, and I would give rare earth elements as an example. Their largest mine, Bayanobo, which is first and foremost an iron mine, actually. It's not a rare earths mine. They're mined as byproducts and co-products from that mine. There's a great picture from The Guardian that shows there's a radioactive byproduct when you process rare earth elements because they often occur simultaneously with thorium and uranium. And so in the United States, we have a very strict process for dealing with that radioactive waste, which I think we would all agree is great because we don't want radioactive waste in our environment. Whereas in China, they do just put that into a free-flowing lake right next to the mine.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Cortez Masto.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member. We appreciate the conversation today, and to the panelists. Let me just say this. Nevada, and many of you know this, it is home to the only active lithium production site in North America and is known to have considerable lithium deposits with several proposed projects currently under review by the Interior Department. But Nevada is also home to many innovative companies in contributing to the growth of domestic critical mineral and battery supply chain, including MP Materials, headquartered in Las Vegas, Dragonfly Energy, lithium-ion battery manufacturer in Reno, Nevada, Redwood Materials, recycling of end-life lithium-ion batteries in Carson City, Nevada, and of course, Tesla. With additional production facilities coming online, as well as Nevada being home to several electric battery and supply chain companies, Nevada is a nexus for our clean energy and our critical mineral future. And so I want to talk about that because I appreciate Senator Barrasso stealing my thunder and bringing from the Nevada Mining Association the permitting, the length that shows how long it takes to permit on the wall. This is just, to me, a reason why we need to streamline our permitting. And I want to talk a little bit about that. So, Ms. Wolf, what specific action should this committee take to increase domestic production of critical minerals while ensuring timeliness of the mine permitting process and the long-term viability of the domestic mining industry?
Thank you very much for the question, Senator, and thank you very much for your work on this important issue. I agree that Nevada is really positioning itself very well for the future economy. I would think there are many things that we could do. First and foremost, what comes to mind is, working with the U.S. Geological Survey here to increase the wonderful work that they do in our geologic mapping. It's very difficult to make good land use planning decisions if we don't know what we have. If we're not going to mine in one place, what does that mean? Where could we get it from somewhere else or not, for our national and economic security. So having a better idea of where our resources are will help with that. I think that, looking to our neighbors to the north, seeing what are they doing a bit better than we are when it comes to getting these things permitted. They do have way fewer people than we do, and it does get a little tricky when you're talking about land disturbance when you have as many people as we do. But, for the NEPA process, we have an environmental impact assessment that has to be done, an EIA. But in Canada, it is an ESIA, an environmental and social impact assessment. And I do feel like more mining companies are beginning to understand that to make sure that they are not slapped with lawsuits one after the next, that they have to have more meaningful and robust engagement with communities. And so, is there a way that we can, legislate that? Or is it something that, speaking with companies and just saying, it behooves you to be a better neighbor, so what can you be doing to go above and beyond to be a better neighbor in your communities?
So do you believe that it is, in this day and age, with the technology that is available to mining companies, there is a way to not only mine, but mine responsibly? So you're still protecting the environment, you're not negating any of the NEPA or the concerns about environmental protection from the water, the air, and the land. There's the ability to do both, responsibly mine and, like you say, take into consideration the stakeholders and the needs for the land as well. Do you agree with that?
I do believe so, and that doesn't mean that there isn't room for improvement. I think that there's always room for improvement, but I do think that there is a way that we can do this responsibly, and also asking maybe mining companies to have an adaptive management plan, which I think has been successful at some existing sites where, you know, communities can go to, whether it's a third-party group or something, and say the issue that is incorrect, work with the mining company to resolve the issue. I think there was something up at the Eagle Mine with like a road salt or something, and water becoming contaminated with salt, and so they were able to quickly remedy that with an adaptive plan.
Thank you. Mr. Melby, you're shaking your head. Would you mind weighing in?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Ms. Wolf has really brought up a good point, is that the regulation is one thing, but mining companies are embracing ESG principles because it's the right thing to do. And not only does it give you the social license to operate in the areas that you want to develop, but it's also it's demanded from the investment community. Companies like BlackRock and others and big investment funds that are providing the capital for operations demand it. So, you know, we've, in our operations, we've embraced the ESG movement completely, looking at ways to generate electricity, source the electricity for our mining projects in South Texas from wind power and nuclear power, which gives us carbon-free electricity to run our mines. This is really, it's a massive trend in the mining industry. You can't go to a mining conference where there aren't 3 or 4 sessions focused on this. So it really, you're seeing a transformation of mining to the latest global standards, highest global standards in uranium and other metals mining.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Rono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Melby and Ms. Padilla, neither of your testimony made mention of indigenous communities and the impact of mining on the indigenous communities. Over 500,000, excuse me, Native Americans live within 10 kilometers of the 160,000 abandoned hard rock mines that dot our western landscape. Mine waste pollution has been tied to negative health impact on Native populations, such as kidney disease and hypertension for those living near abandoned uranium mines, and also threatens the local wildlife that supports subsistence lifestyles and cultural traditions. How do your organizations factor in the comments from local indigenous communities as you go through the process of obtaining a mining permit?
Well, Senator Hirono, absolutely. I mean, gaining social license to operate definitely means the local stakeholders, and in many parts of the Western United States, that means engaging our tribal communities and gaining their consent and becoming partners with them, not adversaries. And again, the injustices that were committed back, you know, in the 50s and 60s is not the mining industry that exists today. And I think the NEPA and the regulatory process that we go through has extensive steps for consultation with communities. But I think innovative mining companies are taking it a step further and providing employment and training for Aboriginal communities and bringing them as part of the success of the project going forward. So it's very important in anything we do.
So I take it that it's in the very early stages of the process that you would want to have the input from the indigenous peoples. Would you agree with that, Ms. Padilla?
Yes, Senator, I really appreciate the question and the opportunity to discuss this. This is a critical piece of our plan. So our tribal engagement started many, many years ago, and we continue to do regular outreach. I mean, the tribes in our area are not just a stakeholder, they're a government. They're a sovereign entity that has the opportunity to contribute to both the process and the ultimate outcome of our mine, and we want to incorporate them at every step of the way, including those that are closest to us.
Ms. Wolf, you mentioned that Canada uses a ESIA process where they determine the social impact. So do you think we should adopt that kind of a process where the social impact is really codified? The requirement for it is codified in these instances of obtaining mining permits?
I do think it is something that the United States should consider. It seems to be very successful in Canada, and I think that, as we've all talked about, the social license is really the most critical piece here. And so if an ESIA will help to achieve that, I think that is correct.
Do you think it would for Ms. Padilla and Mr. Melby?
I think structurally, the regulatory process is set up differently in both Canada and Australia, and where they're utilizing that tool, it is often put together early on in the process. I think it would be very useful as long as it doesn't add additional delays and additional inefficiencies in our current regulatory process.
I mean, what happens if you don't take account of the social impact is that at the other end is when you're going to need to face through lawsuits, et cetera. So it seems to be something that we should definitely look at. I'd like to ask the panel whether all of the panel agrees that we should do more to increase critical mineral recycling. Do all the panelists agree that we can do more to recycle critical minerals? No?
Yes.
Yes.
Dr. Z,
yes.
you're not nodding your head. Are you an outlier here?
That was a grimace. I apologize. I don't have a poker face, but there has been a Critical Minerals Institute at Ames, Iowa, under USDOE funding for possibly 10 years now. And I'm not sure that a whole lot of breakthrough technologies have resulted from that. In other words, what I keep getting back is it's extremely difficult and labor-intensive to actually separate the rare earth elements, or particularly critical minerals, out of a recycled consumer product. You have basically little flakes of things in big masses of plastic and metal. So recycling is very problematic and labor-intensive.
Would you agree, Ms. Wolf?
I think that I think that there are many challenges to recycling right now, but there are places like Redwood Materials in Senator Cortez Masto's district that are doing this effectively and successfully. I think that from a national security standpoint, too, that recycling needs to be very much considered. At the end of the day, these are finite natural resources that are infinitely recyclable. And so, yes, we do need more R&D to make sure that they are economic and in line with, compared to virgin resources. But I think that we are getting there, and we are going to reach a critical mass of these things in the next 10 to 15 years. So we need to make sure that we're not caught flat-footed then just because it's not economic to do it now.
Right. Mr. Chairman, are you doing a hearing next week on recycling of critical minerals?
It's on Tuesday, Thursday. Next Thursday.
Thank you. I'm very interested because our country wastes a lot of stuff, not just in this area, but just about any area you can think of. We throw stuff away. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to thank all of you, all the witnesses. You all done a great. Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Cassidy. Senator Cassidy snuck in on me.
Yeah, you skipped me for Arona, you know what I'm saying? So,
My fault.
Hey, thank you all. I actually have questions on recycling if I get to, but if we're having a hearing next week, I will hold those for the second. Dr. Fortier, I was, in 2019, it was reported by USGS that the deep sea could contain more cobalt, nickel, and rare earth minerals than all land-based reserves combined, and it has forecast that deep sea mining could account for 15% of global supply by 2050. Now, the administration clearly has plans to expand battery-powered vehicles, so that's going to be a big draw upon this. And we have $6 billion in there in the bipartisan infrastructure bill to help with battery manufacturing. So what are your thoughts on what we need to do to source raw materials from the ocean in a way which does not disturb that ocean in an environmentally insensitive way?
I'm not sure I can comment on the policy aspects of that, but certainly deep sea mining offers a lot of potential for resource development. I think from the USGS perspective, the way we view that is that those are still resources. They are not yet reserves. Reserves has an economic connotation, and you need to be able to produce those economically at current pricing and technology. I think the technology is advancing, but nobody is doing that commercially yet. Nobody has yet demonstrated.
I'm told that maybe the Brits and maybe the Swedes are initiating a process to begin sea floor harvesting, if you will.
There has been a lot of activity in this sphere, and I think people are getting closer to that, but nobody that I'm aware of is doing that commercially yet.
Okay. Okay. Now, typically, before we do something commercially, we do something as a pilot program. You begin to establish, you don't want to be the first, but your first has to be done before you can do it more economically. Is that what I've understood about the Brits and others? Are they the ones that are beginning to do the first, to develop the technology?
I think there are a lot of countries that are developing this technology. They're not the only ones.
Then let me ask, because in Louisiana, we have remote operated vehicles that help us with our oil and gas drilling in the Outer Continental Shelf. I don't know the depths, but I'm assuming that an ROV could similarly be employed in this. Is the technology such a reach from what we're already doing as regards ROVs and et cetera?
I'm not an expert in that area, Senator, but we have had briefings from companies that are engaged in oil and gas exploration and production, and they seem to believe that they have technology that can contribute to commercialization of deep-sea resources.
I will now go to my recycling question, because this is more of a market, and I'm not sure who will address this. I was told by some folks back home that they were taking old bauxite that had been used for aluminum, and they're getting critical minerals, and just when they were about to stand it up, the Chinese flooded the market with, normally they keep their price up, and boom, here comes a competitor. They flooded it, drove them out of business, and they rose their prices once more. So the question is, do we have, one, it seems as if we should have a mechanism for almost price support for that sort of predatory activity. Any thoughts on that, Ms. Wolf?
Yes, and thank you, Senator Cassidy, for the question, because it is something that it's something at the forefront of our mind at SAFE, because if we are going to invest, millions to billions of dollars in these critical resources and our downstream capabilities as well, we want to make sure that we can effectively respond to any anti-competitive market behavior that we might be confronted with. So while we don't have, one avenue that we've looked into for rare earths specifically is a processing cooperative, which would attempt to insulate downstream companies and upstream companies from these price fluctuations. But in recognizing that this is a major challenge in all aspects of the supply chain, not just in rare earths processing.
Mr. Zimkowitz?
Yeah, we actually looked at some tailings.
Microphone, please.
Sorry. Yep, it's too far away. So we actually looked at some bauxite tailings from a refinery just upriver. Company sent us some, and we found that the rare earth content was something like 0.5%.
Is that good or bad?
That's fantastic. That's equivalent to a really good ore deposit. And but no one's been able to find a good way to extract that.
Now, I was told they had, but in fact, I told that they were about to open, and the day they opened, boom, the Chinese flooded.
I don't know about that, but this is what I got from my mineral processing colleagues that we're still working on. The technology for extraction and refining is still a ways off.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, and sir, Mr. Melby, did you have something on that?
Well, just a comment that predatory pricing by state-owned companies is a very real thing. And the Chinese and Russians employ that in a lot of commodities where they want to keep us kind of down and advance their interests. So it is a very real threat.
So not only do we have to develop the technology to take this 0.5% and make it economically viable, but we also have a way to stop the predatory, address the predatory pricing activities of the people who control those resources internationally. The one is no good without the other. Okay, well, that's a message to us. Thank you, and I yield.
Now, you want a second round? I want to thank all the witnesses. I think you can tell the interest that we had today, and everyone being here and participating shows the great interest that we have, and also the knowledge that we have a truly need here in America. So we're at a crossroads right now, which way we go and how we use the technology for a better climate, but also making sure we meet the needs of the American public and not hold ourselves hostage to foreign supply chains. That's been my greatest concern. And we all got to be in the same boat. The environmentalists, the industrialists, everybody in the same boat here. If they're not, we're screwed. That's the bottom line. And I've said this, we've got to be able to get, and you saw the concern we had on permitting. Well, I've known it for years, that's been a stumbling block in America right now that keeps us from barely unlocking the energy that we have and the ability that we have to outcompete anyone and outproduce anyone in the world. So with that, Dr. Z, you know what you all are doing, and I spoke to my colleagues here. Everyone's interested in. That's the quick, easy way into that to start meeting the demands that we have. If we're going to build this up, we've got to be able to do that, but also getting into it to where we can really get into the mining and processing. I truly believe that if the United States of America does not lead the charge on a North American energy alliance by using the resources that we have here in the North American continent that helps us be energy independent, but also an energy supplier for the free world, so they don't have to depend on other parts of the world that can use it and weaponize it against them, which they've done, and they will do it. I've said this also. What we've seen Russia do by weaponizing energy, I'll guarantee you, China will do the same thing weaponizing critical minerals that we need. That's not, I don't think, any far-fetched for any of us to believe that'll happen. And, but with that, again, thank you all. You made an effort to be here, and we appreciate it very much. Members are going to have to close the business tomorrow to submit